Hey, I'm Roland with Mobile Geeks, and what we have right here are the Moto G on the one side and the new Moto E on the right side. So what I'm going to do now is just give you a quick rundown of the differences between the two devices and maybe even tell you which one you should rather buy. So the Moto E is a new budget smartphone from Motorola. It's even cheaper than the Moto G, where the Moto G was a great deal with its 720p screen, 4.5 inches of IPS goodness right there, based on a quad core, and is overall pretty much a great device except for the fact that it doesn't or didn't have a micro SD card slot until the new version that got announced today that also includes LTE and now has a micro SD card slot. It's pretty much the smartphone of choice if you want to have an Android that is totally up to date, combined with decent hardware at a very, very competitive price. The same thing is pretty much the case with the Moto E. So Motorola is trying to push this to emerging markets like India, for example, or Eastern Europe, and they're even launching it in the UK and Germany, for example. Where this one comes in at just over 160 euros right now. This is the 8 gig version. The LTE version is even going to be only going to be like 200 euros or something. And this guy actually costs 119 euros, and in countries like India, they're selling it for 7,000 rupees, which is just around 100, no, just 90 euros, I guess. And in the UK, it's available for 89 pounds, and in the US, it's coming out for, I think, 119 US dollars or 129. I don't exactly remember. But it's definitely the same thing going on right here. So they're offering great hardware or pretty good hardware for the price. So the differences are, first, the size. So the 4.3-inch panel on the Moto E makes it a bit smaller than the Moto G, that's for sure. Weight-wise, they're pretty much the same. So the Moto E comes in at 142 grams, I think, and the Moto G is 143, although it is a bit bigger. Displays are totally different actually because the 4.3-inch panel on the Moto E only is a QHD panel. They're both IPS panels. This guy has 940 by 960 by 540 pixels, so it's QHD resolution. As I said, both IPS panels, but as you can see, there's a big difference in brightness right here. So they're both set to the highest brightness settings right now, and the Moto G is definitely a lot brighter than the Moto E. Also, colors tend to wash out way earlier on the Moto E than on the Moto G. So if you look at these from the side, they're both pretty decently readable, but the colors are definitely washing out earlier on the Moto E right here. Also in sharpness, as this is a 720p panel on the Moto G, it's much sharper than the panel on the Moto E right here. So if you look at it, the device, if you don't keep the device at the typical angle or distance you would use that from your face, you're definitely going to see some pixels right there, whereas the 720p screen in the 4.5-inch form factor on the Moto G is definitely a lot sharper. Next up, there is no camera on the front of the Moto E right here, so these are just the brightness and distance sensors, where the Moto G has although it's a low resolution cam, it does have a front camera. So if you need that, want to make selfies, the Moto E is definitely not for you. On the bottom, they both don't have capacitive touch buttons, but on-screen buttons right there. And one of the main differences design-wise is that the Moto E has a speaker down there, where the Moto E has its speaker on the back. They've moved that part to the front on the Moto E right here. So I wanted to give you a quick sound comparison of the two devices, and I'm just going to use the alarm clocks since these are copyright free and we don't want to risk anything. Just going to switch down here to, I think, let's go with Platinum. So that's the speaker on the Moto G. Let me just stop that right there, and now the front speaker on the Moto E. So I don't know if you heard that, but for me they're pretty much just as loud. They're pretty much the same volume right here, so there's not a big difference, and the sound is pretty much the same as far as I could tell from what I tried. I did try some sound, some music, and they pretty much sound the same. They're not great, but they're pretty loud, and yeah, definitely decent speakers on these devices, at least for the price. Now let's go to the back of both phones. We have cameras on the back. That's good. They're both 5 megapixel cameras, but the Moto G does have autofocus on here and an LED flash, whereas the Moto E does not have an LED flash and it doesn't even have autofocus. So if you switch to the camera right here, you will have problems getting close to things. You can see that there's no autofocus in here. You just tap and it only takes a picture. It doesn't focus or anything. And if I do the same thing on the Moto G right here, you'll see that this focus ring shows up and you just tap to focus and it autofocuses and takes a picture later on. So cameras are definitely a big difference on both devices. I know that the camera on the Moto G is more on the crappy side, but the one on the Moto E is even lower quality than that. Weight-wise, they're just about the same. So the Moto E comes in at 142 grams and the Moto G weighs 143. If you look at the thickness though, you will see that the Moto E is definitely a lot chunkier. It's not only smaller or a bit smaller, but it's also way chunkier. The battery is pretty much the same. So the Moto G has 2070 milliampere hours, where this has 1980 milliampere hours. So maybe the Moto E would even be able to have a longer run time than the Moto G. They're both supposed to last up to a day though. Other than that, hardware-wise, there's a bunch of differences in this. So the Moto G is available with 8 gigs and 16 gigs, and it doesn't have a micro SD card slot, except when you choose the new LTE version. That does have a micro SD card slot now, but it didn't have one, so that's one of the older versions. And the new Moto E does actually have a micro SD card slot, but it only has a 4 gigs of onboard flash storage. So performance-wise, there's also a big difference because the Moto G actually has a quad core running at 1.2 gigahertz. That's a Qualcomm Snapdragon 400 right there, and you get a Snapdragon 200 running at 1.2 gigahertz, dual core only on the Moto G. So as you can see in this quick benchmark and to-do benchmark, Moto G scores about a third higher than the Moto E right here. RAM is on the same on both devices, so they both have 1 gig of RAM. So that's pretty decent, and they're both running Android 4.4.2 KitKat, and Motorola is even guaranteeing that you will get the next major version of Android, whichever it's going to be, on this device too. So I've been rolling with the Mobile Geeks, giving you a quick overview of the Moto E and the Moto G.